Hi everybody, welcome back to another episode of Rappin with the Rep. I am State Representative Ken Gordon. I'm delighted to have State Representative Simon Cataldo from Concord, our neighboring district. Simon has been serving in the legislature. This is your second term now, right?
Yes.
And it's been just my pleasure. It's been delightful to work with Simon over these years. He is a member of the Joint Committee on Education, and I am the House Chair of that Joint Committee, and so we've had the opportunity to work together pretty closely this session. And again, it's been an honor and a pleasure to do that. Simon was a teacher before he joined the legislature. Actually, he was a lawyer before he joined the legislature, a teacher before that. And that's relevant to the conversation we're going to have about some of the bills that we're looking at, and one that we already sent through the House and passed through the House last week. I want to talk about Simon's experience in the teaching field. So out of college, you intended to be a science teacher in Harlem, isn't that right?
I sure did. And Ken, thanks for having me. Right back at you with everything you said. Been such a pleasure, so much fun, and as we'll talk about, very productive to work with you on some of this education policy that's moving through the legislature now. And I went to Colorado College. I majored in environmental science. Like many folks at that time, this is 2008, I was recruited by Teach for America to join Teach for America. And I thought, this is great. I'll ask for a placement in high school science because I was very interested in science.
Just
I wanted to teach high schoolers.
Not to interrupt you. Tell the folks what Teach for America is.
Yeah, Teach for America it's an AmeriCorps program. It's kind of similar to the Peace Corps in some ways, but you teach at typically low-income school districts, and you do so right out of college. So they give you a transitional certification to start teaching right away. And so I went into that program. It's still very popular, but it was probably at its peak around then, 2008, 2009, and went to Harlem, New York City to teach high school science. I was hired at a 6th through 12th grade school, and I did my whole initial summer training and taught summer school. It went really well. I was teaching students who were retaking the state exam in chemistry, so they wanted to be there to pass their chemistry state exam. And then 4 days before school started, the entire faculty of the school, very large K through 12 school for Harlem, is in the cafeteria as part of our professional development. The principal, Dr. Gregory Hodge, may he rest in peace, one of my heroes, brings me up as one of the part of the cohort of the new teachers and says to everybody with this big megaphone, he used to walk around the school with a big megaphone, and he says, everybody listen up, this is Mr. Cataldo. It's not how you pronounce my name, kid. And he's the new 7th and 8th grade special education math teacher. And I said, oh, that's not what I thought I was hired to do, certainly not what I'm qualified to do. And so I went up to him later that day. And if you've done Teach for America or been in a similar situation, this story will not surprise you at all. I go into his office and I say, very, very meekly, and I just turned 22 years old. I'm in this big school in Harlem. I said, Dr. Hodge, I think there's been a mistake. I'm teaching high school chemistry. And he says, Cataldo, the real special ed 7th and 8th grade math teacher quit this morning. You can have her job or you're fired.
Nice.
And this was in 2008.
Yeah.
We're at the beginning of the recession, the economic crisis, and I didn't have a backup job, and I had signed an apartment lease, and so I was there. So I went back into my classroom 4 days later, or into my classroom 4 days later, and it was readily apparent how unprepared I was for that situation. I had some students who had very severe learning disabilities. I had other students, and this is what I think is most relevant for our bill, who were very, very bright, but they had either a significant emotional challenge that didn't allow them to be in a regular class, a mainstream class, or something else had happened. Maybe they were at some point an English language learner and had been placed in special education and had not made their way out, but were academically gifted at the same time. And I was teaching math, so in a 12-to-1 setting. So that was kind of how I got into that whole world.
And then I'm gonna jump off to the legislation that we just passed, and then go back again to talk about how your experience drew you to first filing this legislation and then working with me as we shepherded it and amended it somewhat, right, to become a bill that the House put on the floor and voted unanimously 155-0 to pass. What this bill does is it looks at the way that we teach reading to kindergarten through third grade. And what we did was we looked at the undeniable fact that our reading scores on the fourth grade MCAS, which would reflect our teaching in K through 3, have been falling. They've been falling like the scores in the rest of the country, no different from that, but still they're falling, and we have to address that. We like to say that we have the top-rated schools in the nation, and that's true, remains true. But what's also true is that's because the states in the nation, their scores have been falling as well. We need to put an end to that decline. And what we found in working together is that the trajectory of our decline has been as bad or worse than a majority of the states in the nation. What we found was that, among other things, that many of our municipalities have been teaching reading to these younger kids using a very, very popular program that became popular about 20 years ago, and it became the gold standard. And what it did was it taught kids to read by reading together a sentence, and then there's a word that may be a more difficult word in that sentence for some of the kids to read. And what the teachers are taught to do in that case is, rather than sound out the word using phonics, what they'll do is they'll cover the word up and say, rather than relying on the letters of a word to read the word, let's do something different. Let's, for example, show you a picture. And from the picture that's shown to you, now you can guess at what the word would be. And now you can remember, when we read that sentence again, what the word was. But you've never read the word. You've just had a memory trigger to recall what the word would be, right? That's not reading. And that, and many experts have told us, is not evidence-based reading. It's essentially guessing. And it hurts a student's ability to start to actually effectively read as they go through their later grades, where they have to read in order to learn. They say that in the younger grades you learn to read and then you read to learn. So this bill looked at putting a stop, really, to teaching kids to read by ignoring letters, actively ignoring letters, right, and looking at pictures. It doesn't mean that you can't show a child a picture. Of course you can. But you can't show the child the picture with this bill, if it becomes law, instead of sounding out the word, right? When you got to school, out of college, you worked with kids that were having trouble reading. You told me the story about the frustration you had and the interaction you had with these kids. Can you talk about that?
When I started, I had no context, and so I'll explain to you how it appeared to me at that time. I had these students, many of whom, as I said before, were very, very bright and were able to do very complex algebra and geometry as 7th and 8th graders on a 9th or 10th grade level. We were doing things like quadratic equations, multivariable algebra problems, things like that, that did not require reading. And sometimes I would have the students read out loud or do these word problems, and they would read really fast, same kids. And they'd get most of the words right, but some of them wrong. And initially I thought they're just rushing, or they're being defiant because they just want to go so fast and they're not slowing down to read the words. What I began to understand over the course of weeks and months is these very bright kids had been taught to use context-based methods to read. And so they're looking at the picture that sets up the algebra or geometry problem, or they're just guessing the words based on the other words that they see by sight words around them. These same very bright students, I eventually figured out, could not sound out words. And faced with that reality, it was terrifying because I realized that these kids were now 13, 14, 15 years old. They could not read really at all. They could not sound out words. They did not learn phonics. And in most cases, it was not principally because they were dyslexic, although there were dyslexic students in my class. It was because they had been taught to guess in the way that you described, but also using other types of context. And it was terrifying as it was for me, it was really demoralizing for them to be confronted with the fact that they couldn't read. And they thought of themselves as very smart, and they were very smart, but they couldn't read at an even elementary level, phonics-wise. So that is what we had to start working through, because when they got to these hard word problems and they could do the math, even a simple arithmetic word problem, if they did not recognize more than one or two or even just one key word in that sentence, they couldn't sound it out. They didn't have the skills to do that.
Yeah, and you told me that in the beginning you thought the reliance on the picture was just essentially because they just didn't want to sound out the word, and then it came to you after a while, no, this is what you were actually taught to do in this school, or the school that taught you.
And Ken, I've heard from so many teachers, both after filing this bill, in the process of filing it, and most of all after we passed it, because that's when a lot of people found out about it, or more people found out about it, from so many teachers in a similar situation to what I've been in, where they receive these students who are past K through 3. This bill, as you mentioned, is really geared at early literacy, kindergarten, third grade, but they receive these students who are older in their classroom. They've been taught to read this way, and it's really hard as a teacher to try to unwind these bad practices and integrate phonics-based practices when the kids are already older and they don't want to be told. You know, if anyone who has the fourth or fifth or sixth grader in their life, whether it's their kid or otherwise, they know those kids don't want to be told, actually, you can't read. That's a tough situation to be in, both for the child and the teacher, and definitely for the parent, as we've heard time and time again through testimony on this bill. Yeah,
so some folks watching this, hearing us talk about this, I included, found this hard to believe, because we were taught to read using phonics. We were taught to read by sounding out the word. And so if we came across a word that was difficult to read, we'd slow down, we'd break the word into its letters, maybe if it was a bigger word, to syllables, and then we'd put the letters together and we'd say it out loud. And we, or our children, because I don't remember that far back, but the process is the reader, the young reader, would sound it out and then match it to their verbal vocabulary. Dog, for example. They may not know how to spell the word dog in the very beginning, but they say dog. Oh, I know that word verbally. Dog. It's dog. And the light goes on, right? But maybe 20 years ago or so, this new reading program swept its way through the country. As I said in the beginning, this new gold standard was explained to school administrators that this is really the way to go. And it became the most popular program in the nation. It coincided, unfortunately, with our decline in reading scores.
Right.
And more recently, scientists have, specialists in academics, have seen that, and starting a few years ago, another wave swept the nation, which was that at this point, 13 states have passed laws restricting access to this 3Qing, or whole word method of teaching, in elementary schools, in public elementary schools, because they realize this isn't right. Here in Burlington and in Bedford, where I also represent, they have realized that there's a better way to teach, going back to phonics-based teaching, and they have switched back to phonics. I think 2 or 3 years ago, both districts. So if you're watching from those districts, your towns aren't doing it. But about a third of the towns of the districts in Massachusetts are still using, or in whole or in part, they still want to have access to this teaching method that specialists say just not only doesn't it work, but as you explained, it hinders a child's ability to be able to read when they get into the later grades.
Yeah, and you can see how there's a particular segment of kids who are most at risk for really never learning phonics in this context, which are the kids who are very bright. They can put 2 and 2 together, and they can basically trick everyone into thinking that they can read, because 9 times out of 10 there's going to be enough context that they can get most of the words. And it's those kids who can get passed from grade to grade to grade.
Right.
You really get quite older, and then eventually you do need to know how to sound things out, and that's been tough. But what was so inspiring to me about this bill, Ken, is that just hearing from teacher after teacher who told us about the power of switching to an evidence-based method of literacy instruction. And that gives me a lot of hope that, first of all, the districts that have already moved in that direction are going to see a lot of changes. Certainly the stats from other states back that up. But also that what this bill is going to be able to do to help move along kids in districts that have been using this debunked methodology. And I just so happened to be teaching right at kind of the sweet spot, which is the opposite of the of the right term, but the sweet spot for 3 cueing methods, where most of the kids that I was teaching had been brought up using that type of approach. And so I just saw firsthand what the effects were. As you said, people who were taught before the 3 cueing era, I think when you explain to them what it is, they think that is so unintuitive. How did that ever catch on?
Right.
And really, I don't have a great answer for that. Perhaps you have a better one, but things happen in education just like in other walks of life, where there's some kind of shiny new thing that becomes popularized, and then it takes a while sometimes to realize that it didn't actually work.
Yeah. You mentioned hearing from teachers who switched back to a phonics-based method. When we had our hearing on this, which took hours on this topic, we heard from teachers who said, I was hired at a school that used this curricula, this cueing, this picture curricula, and then I realized it wasn't working, and I went back to phonics, and the same kids, the same children in K through, all of a sudden they started doing better. I could see they were doing better. We had no one who came to testify who said, I switched back to phonics and it didn't help.
Right.
Nobody had that experience. I've heard that it may be useful in ESL, English as a Second Language, and I don't understand, because we have colleagues in the legislature who learned English as a second language. And if you're an older student, teenager or so, you come to learn English with a written language already learned. And so you can translate a written word to a written word. I don't understand why you would need a picture in lieu of the written word. The textbook, for example, when I took French as a second language in school, the textbook we had would have an English word and a French word, written both. I wouldn't need a picture, especially if it's a noun. I could see a picture. There is so much to this. What if you're talking about an adverb? What if you're talking about a word that represents a concept that can't easily be depicted in a picture? Then what do you do?
Well, I think one reason or explanation for how that sentiment, and I think it's really a minority sentiment in terms of, oh, these methods work better for ELL students, or maybe are necessary for ELL students. I think that, and would be consistent with my experience and what I've heard from teachers, when you have an ELL student coming over, if they do have a picture, and the picture translates culturally, it's a kid from a country where there's a lot of baseball and they see a baseball bat, then maybe they can read the word by looking at the picture, and so they know that says bat. And so from the teacher's perspective, they're not inside the kid's head, so they don't know if they covered up the baseball bat, well, then they wouldn't be doing 3 cueing, right?
Right.
And so it may look like they're learning to read, but actually they're not learning to read. I think one of the other important points is that the science of phonics has become more dynamic in the past several decades. And so it's definitely true that there's kind of other aspects of phonics that may not be that familiar to folks who taught it 40 years ago. But still, today, it is the case that phonics-based approaches work best. You have to, no matter what, be able to sound out the word. It starts with that. And what our bill does, what I really like about the bill and the changes you made to the bill, is it doesn't crowd out other methods that make phonics more dynamic. All it does is ensure that what we have is principally based in something that is supported by evidence.
Yeah, we allow the districts, if they think they have a better idea, to approach the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education and present that idea. And if that department agrees that that's a good idea too, they include this. And so we're not requiring a school to teach in a certain way, but we are requiring that a school not teach in this one particular way, that a majority of our districts voluntarily aren't doing it anymore. But this reaches those that find it difficult when you've been teaching a certain way for decades to have to come to the understanding that there's a better way to do it. And that's where we are. So this bill went through this week, the House. Like I said, it got a unanimous vote, and it goes off to the Senate. The Senate has been, Senate President was quoted just days later as being impressed with the legislation and interested in taking it up soon. So the kind of legislative process, therefore, is that it's in the Senate now. They will address it. Maybe they'll have some changes as well. If they do, they'll bring that back to the House. We may be able to agree between us to these changes. If not, we have to work it out. But it looks like from the most significant principles of this bill, we would agree to it. It looks like we would agree. And so then it would go to the governor for signature. We've been working with the administration on this bill, so I expect we're going to have the governor's support as well. And that's when it would be signed into law.
And the governor has been a leader with the legislature in literacy launch grants to help implement evidence-based literacy instruction, which is part of the reason why we know this works in Massachusetts, because the districts that have received the funding to do this under the same constraints and framework that the bill has essentially have really, they were saying it works. And we're seeing that it's working now.
So we've left ourselves about, actually I left us for about 5.5 minutes until the end of our show. And there was another topic I want to talk about. And I think if you have the patience to do this, I may actually invite you back so we could do a deeper dive into this one, because it's got a lot of public interest and it does pertain to the students in Burlington and Bedford directly. And that's the issue of cell phones in schools. That has not come through the House yet. That's still in our committee. But at this point, we are really looking at, and this has come through the Senate. So this came through the opposite direction. The Senate has already put it on the floor and voted on it. We can talk about that bill in the time that we have left. And then it's up to the House now to address the Senate's proposal, which we in the committee are working on right now. I think what I'd like to do is maybe bring you back at some point, and we can talk about that once we complete that work on it, and we're in that position where we've both put our ideas down. But here's what the Senate did, okay? So the Senate's proposal is that the cell phones would be turned off, would be left inaccessible to students from bell to bell. Bell to bell meaning when they arrive in school during the morning until they leave school in the afternoon, and during school-sponsored events during the school day. That might be a field trip. It means not class to class. It means bell to bell is what's in the Senate bill. They leave it up to the school district to determine how to accomplish that. The common ways to do it right now are either voluntarily, you just don't take your cell phone out. Some schools are doing that and leaving it to the student. Some are leaving it to the teacher, where the common parlance is it's a shoe tree method, where you take your phone and you put it in a box somewhere in the class, and then the student has access to it again between classes. And then there's something called a yonder pouch, where you get to school and you put your phone into a magnetized pouch, which is a little bit bigger than the size of a phone, and it's snapped shut magnetically so that the student still has the physical phone, but they can't get to it because it's been basically locked shut and then opened again. That's another issue that our committee is working on, another issue that you've had some tremendous input and interest in.
I think it's really exciting. And I think it's exciting really for the same reason I think the evidence-based literacy approach is exciting. It's because, you know, we believe science when it comes to climate, we believe science when it comes to healthcare, we believe science when it comes to education, and right now the evidence is just overwhelming that we have to take a very significant step to keep these devices out of school for educational purposes. The state and local taxpayers are investing a lot in our public schools, and so much of that investment is being frittered away by distraction, and we need to do something about that. And the evidence shows a lot about mental health impact on our kids from using this. School-based restrictions are not going to stop kids from ever using cell phones, but it would set a new cultural norm, and it would also keep it away from them for really significant parts of the day.
Yeah.
So I think it's quite exciting that we're potentially going to join other states in going in this direction.
Yeah. So from a social emotional point of view, as you mentioned, first of all, the evidence really shows that when cell phones are removed from schools, attention span increases and grades go up.
Right.
And we've seen that already from the districts that have been able to successfully accomplish that. And the ones that are the most successful at doing it are the ones that do look at bell to bell, because in between classes, if students then look at their phone, they catch up on messages. Some of those messages are very distracting to them.
Yep.
Bullying happens in school on cell phones, and so the bullying can continue to happen on a message received between classes, whether it's sent between classes or during the class. That student now arrives in the next class completely distracted because they got a message that they didn't need to see at that time.
Right.
The other things that we hear about are the social development of our students, where there was a time where at recess, for example, kids would play together, or other times that there were opportunities for social community development, and now students are seen mostly looking at their phones and isolated. Lunchtime and things like that, and so it would address that issue as well.
Yeah, it's so exciting to be serving with you on the education committee at a time when there's just this confluence of very important issues, and it's exciting that the speaker, the leadership, you certainly are willing to take these on. Neither of these issues that we've talked about today are, there's 100% agreement, and at the same time, they're so important in terms of making sure that our kids are getting what they need out of school.
Yeah, and there are some issues that we need to leave to the district. In fact, most that we would leave to the district. There are some where the districts come to us, many districts come to us and say, please take this on, because it's difficult at the district level. There's a lot of pressure at the district level, and we need some uniformity as to how we address certain issues. And the ones we're talking about today are in that group.
Yes.
So what I propose is we're going to revisit when we have a little more time after we've gone further down the legislative process on this, because it is important, and I know it's of interest to so many people. So Representative Simon Cataldo, thank you for being here on Rapping with the Rep. Folks, we're looking forward to talking to you next time. Tune back in. I'm Ken Gordon, and this is Rapping with the Rep.